I was standing in my driveway with a coffee mug in hand, watching the crane operator position his equipment next to my 70-foot ham radio tower, when I realized that Susan Pemberton had actually gone through with her threat. The equipment wasn't mine. I hadn't called for any removal service. This was all Susan, the HOA president of Ridgewood Heights in Aurora, Colorado, and she was making good on her promise to tear down what she called an eyesore that violated some obscure community guideline she'd apparently discovered in a dusty binder from 1987. My name is Isaac Nelson, and I'm a licensed amateur radio operator with the call sign KE0XYZ. I've lived in this subdivision for 8 years, and my tower had been standing for 7 of them without a single complaint until Susan moved in next door 6 months ago. "Excuse me," I called out, jogging toward the crane operator. What do you think you're doing?" The man, a burly guy in his 50s with a weathered face, looked down from the cab. "Got a work order here to remove a radio tower. This the address?" "This is my property, and I didn't authorize this." He frowned and pulled out a clipboard, squinting at the paperwork. "Says here the Ridgewood Heights Homeowners Association requested the removal. Got all the signatures and everything." "They can't just remove something from my property without my permission. That's illegal." The operator shrugged. "Look, buddy, I just do what the work order says. You got a problem? Take it up with whoever hired us. I got paid in advance and I'm doing the job." I felt my face getting hot. "If you touch that tower, I'm calling the police." "The HOA lady said you might say that." He gestured toward the street, where Susan's silver Mercedes had just pulled up. "Said to call her if there was any trouble." Susan Pemberton climbed out of her car like she was stepping onto a red carpet, all confidence and entitlement. She was 48, wore expensive athleisure wear that probably cost more than my monthly utilities, and had that particular haircut that suburban HOA presidents seem to favor, sort of a short bob that says, "I want to speak to the manager," without words. "Isaac," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I tried to resolve this amicably." "Amicably? You're tearing down my property without my consent. The tower violates HOA Guidelines Section 7.3, subsection B, which clearly states that no structure exceeding 20 feet in height may be erected without board approval." She pulled out her phone and began reading from it. "You never submitted the proper paperwork when you installed this monstrosity." "I moved here after it was already up. The previous owner installed it, and it was grandfathered in. Besides, there's something called the PRB1 federal regulation that protects amateur radio installations." Susan's smile turned sharp. PRB1 requires reasonable accommodation, not unlimited permission. The board voted, and we determined this tower is unreasonable. It blocks my view, decreases property values, and frankly, it's ugly. Your view. You can barely see it from your house. Nevertheless, the decision has been made. You had 30 days to remove it yourself. You didn't. So we're removing it for you, and you'll be billed for the service. I pulled out my own phone. "I'm calling the police right now. This is destruction of private property." "Go ahead," Susan said, examining her manicured nails. "Officer Daniels is a friend of mine. He knows all about this situation." I dialed anyway, and sure enough, when the dispatcher connected me to an officer, I got a runaround about civil matters and HOA disputes. They wouldn't send anyone out unless there was an active crime in progress, and apparently an HOA removing property after due process didn't qualify. I was told to contact a lawyer and resolve it in court. By the time I hung up, the crane operator had already begun extending his boom toward my tower. "Stop!" I shouted. "You need to know something. That tower isn't just for hobby use. I'm part of the Skywarn network and the Amateur Radio Emergency Service. FEMA uses my station as a backup relay for emergency broadcasts in this region." Susan rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. Now you're making things up to save your little toy." "I'm not making anything up. Check with the Boulder County Office of Emergency Management. My call sign is registered with them. During the Marshall Fire in 2021, when cell towers went down, amateur radio operators like me were the only communication link for emergency services." "That's not my problem," Susan said. "Should have thought about that before you violated HOA rules." "I didn't violate anything, and even if I did, you can't just destroy property. There's a legal process." "We followed the legal process. You were notified by certified mail. I never got any certified mail. Susan pulled out another document from her leather portfolio. Signature right here shows it was delivered 3 weeks ago. I looked at the signature. It wasn't mine. It wasn't even close. That's not my signature. Take it up with the post office. The crane's engine roared louder, and the operator began positioning the boom. I looked up at my tower, at the beam antenna at the top that I'd spent weeks tuning perfectly, at the cables running down to my shack in the garage where I had thousands of dollars in equipment. This wasn't just about the tower. If it came down wrong, it could destroy my entire station. At least let me disconnect the equipment first, I pleaded. There are coaxial cables, rotor wires, electrical connections. If you just yank it down, you'll destroy everything. Susan checked her watch. You have 10 minutes. I sprinted to my garage, my heart pounding. My Radio Shack was my pride and joy, a 10 by 12 space filled with transceivers, computers, monitors, and all the gear I'd accumulated over 15 years as a ham operator. I grabbed my tools and ran outside to the tower base, where the cable entry box housed all the connections. My hands shook as I worked, disconnecting the coaxial lines first, then the rotor control cables. The 10 minutes Susan gave me wasn't enough, not even close, but I worked as fast as I could. I could hear her talking on her phone behind me, laughing about something, completely unconcerned that she was destroying something I'd worked years to build. Time's up, Susan announced. I need 5 more minutes, please. The crane operator has another job across town. Either he does it now, or you get billed for a second visit. I managed to disconnect the main feed line and the rotor cable, but the grounding system and some of the guy wire anchors were still connected. I backed away, watching helplessly as the crane operator positioned a thick strap around the tower about 20 feet up. Wait, you can't lift it like that, I yelled. The guy wires need to be released first in sequence or the whole thing will buckle. The operator looked at Susan, who waved her hand dismissively. Just get it done. What happened next played out in horrible slow motion. The crane took tension on the strap, and the tower began to creak. The guy wires, still anchored at 3 points around my yard, held firm for a moment. Then one anchor pulled free from the ground with a crack like a gunshot. The tower twisted, and the top section bent at an unnatural angle. The beam antenna, my beautiful 6-element Yagi that had taken me 3 weekends to assemble and tune, broke free and crashed into my roof, punching through the shingles with a sickening crunch. No, I shouted, but there was nothing I could do. The crane operator, realizing something was wrong, tried to lower the tension, but it was too late. The tower folded in the middle, guy wires snapping loose and whipping through the air like steel cables. One wire caught the crane's boom with a metallic clang. Another smashed through my garage window. The whole structure came down in a twisted, screaming mess of aluminum and steel, crashing across my yard and into my neighbor's fence on the other side. The noise was incredible, a prolonged, grinding cacophony that brought neighbors out of their houses up and down the street. When the dust settled, my tower lay in ruins across 2 properties. My roof had a hole the size of a kitchen table, my garage window was shattered, and the fence belonging to my neighbor Tom was destroyed. The crane operator sat in his cab, white-faced, staring at the destruction. I stood there, breathing hard, my hands clenched into fists. You happy now, Susan? She'd gone pale too, but she recovered quickly. That damage is on you, Isaac. If you'd removed it properly when we first asked, none of this would have happened. Get off my property, right now. This isn't over. You're still responsible for the removal fees, plus you'll be fined for the damage to the common areas. What common areas? That's Tom's fence. The fence borders the common green space, HOA property. You'll be billed for repairs. I took a step toward her, and she backed up quickly. I'm warning you, Isaac, don't threaten me. I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you that you just made the biggest mistake of your life. Get out. Susan climbed into her Mercedes and drove away, tires squealing. The crane operator climbed down, looking sick. Listen, man, I'm sorry. That wasn't supposed to happen like that. Just leave, I said quietly. Send the bill to the HOA. He didn't argue. Within 15 minutes, he'd loaded his crane and left, leaving me standing in my destroyed yard looking at thousands of dollars in damage. Tom came over from next door, a retired accountant in his 70s who'd always been friendly. Isaac, I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do? Did you see what happened? Saw the whole thing. That HOA woman wouldn't let you do it right. This is on her. Would you be willing to write down what you saw? Absolutely. You need me to testify or whatever, I'm there. I thanked him and went inside, stepping over debris in my garage. My hands were still shaking as I picked up my phone and started making calls. First, I called my insurance company and filed a claim. Then, I called a lawyer, a guy named David Chen who'd handled a friend's HOA dispute a few years back. His secretary said he could see me the next morning. Then, I sat down at my computer and logged into the ARRL website, the American Radio Relay League, the National Association for Amateur Radio. I filed a formal complaint about the tower destruction and asked for legal resources. I also sent emails to the Boulder County Office of Emergency Management, FEMA Region 8, and the Colorado Emergency Management Office, explaining what had happened and noting that my emergency communications capability had been destroyed. I didn't expect much immediate response. It was 4 p.m. on a Tuesday. But I was documenting everything. The insurance adjuster arrived within 2 hours, an efficient woman named Patricia, who took photos, measured the roof damage, and noted everything. This is going to be complicated, she said. Your policy covers the tower under personal property, but the HOA might claim they had authority to remove it. That could affect the claim. They didn't have authority. They forged my signature on the delivery receipt. Patricia made a note. Get a handwriting expert to confirm that. It'll help your case. In the meantime, I'll start processing the claim, but expect pushback from our legal department. This is messy. After she left, I covered the hole in my roof with a tarp as best I could, using a ladder and some 2x4s to secure it. Storm clouds were building over the Rockies to the west, and the last thing I needed was rain damage on top of everything else. My phone rang as I was climbing down the ladder. It was a Boulder area code I didn't recognize. Mr. Nelson, this is Margaret Chen from the Boulder County Office of Emergency Management. I got your email about your tower. That was fast. Your call sign is flagged in our system as a priority resource. We have you listed as one of 3 Skywarn relay stations covering the Eastern Plains corridor. What exactly happened? I explained the whole situation while she listened in increasingly concerned silence. When I finished, she said, Mr. Nelson, do you understand what this means? We're heading into severe weather season. Your station provides coverage for a 20-mile radius that includes 2 towns and a major highway corridor. If we have a tornado outbreak or flash flooding, we have no backup communications for that area now. I know, I tried to tell them. Who authorized this removal? I need names. I gave her Susan Pemberton's name and the HOA information. Margaret said she'd be making some calls and asked me to send her all the documentation I had. I promised I would. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the tower, about years of work destroyed in minutes. I thought about the conversations I'd had with other operators around the world, the contests I'd won, the emergency drills I'd participated in. Ham radio wasn't just a hobby for me. It was a calling, a way to serve my community while doing something I loved. Around midnight, a thunderstorm rolled through, and I lay in bed listening to rain hammer against the tarp over my roof, praying it would hold. Water started dripping into my bedroom around 1 a.m. I spent the rest of the night with buckets positioned strategically around the room. The next morning, I met with David Chen at his office in downtown Denver. He was a sharp guy in his early 40s, with experience in both HOA disputes and FCC regulations. I laid out everything that had happened. He listened carefully, taking notes. Okay, here's the situation. You have several strong arguments. First, the PRB1 regulation requires HOAs to provide reasonable accommodation for amateur radio antennas. Second, if they really did forge the signature on that certified mail receipt, that's fraud. Third, the way they conducted the removal was reckless and caused unnecessary damage. Fourth, and this is big, interfering with emergency communications infrastructure could be a federal offense. Can we stop them from billing me for the removal? We can fight it, but more importantly, we're going to go after them for damages, the roof, the garage, your equipment, Tom's fence, all of it. plus emotional distress, loss of use, and possibly punitive damages if we can prove malice. How much is this going to cost me? I'll work on contingency for the damages portion, 30% of whatever we recover. For the injunctive relief and administrative stuff, we can do a flat fee, say $3,000 to start. I didn't have $3,000 lying around, but I didn't have much choice. I told him I'd get him a retainer check by the end of the week. Over the next few days, things escalated quickly. David filed an emergency motion in district court for an injunction against the HOA, asking the judge to prevent them from fining me or taking any further action until the dispute was resolved. The hearing was set for the following week. Meanwhile, Margaret from the Office of Emergency Management had apparently made quite a few calls. On Thursday morning, 2 men in suits showed up at my door, identifying themselves as representatives from FEMA Region 8. They wanted to inspect the damage and document the loss of emergency communications capability. They spent an hour taking photos, examining the wreckage, and interviewing me about the station's capabilities. One of them, a serious man named Robert Ford, told me that FEMA took infrastructure interference very seriously. The problem is, Robert explained, civilian authorities often don't understand the critical role amateur radio plays in emergency management. When cell towers go down, when landlines fail, when the internet is out, you guys are the last line of communication. What your HOA did wasn't just petty vandalism. They eliminated a critical resource during severe weather season. Can you do anything about it? We're documenting everything. We'll be sending a formal letter to the HOA and possibly referring this to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Interfering with emergency communications can fall under federal obstruction statutes. After they left, I felt a small glimmer of hope. This was bigger than just me and my tower. It was about emergency preparedness for an entire region. That afternoon, I got an email from the HOA. It was from Susan, and it was brief and cold. Your account has been charged $2,800 for emergency tower removal, $500 for common area fence repair, and $1,000 fine for unauthorized structure violation. Total due, $4,300. Payment expected within 30 days or a lien will be placed on your property. I forwarded it to David immediately. He called me 10 minutes later. Don't pay a dime. This is exactly the kind of overreach we're going to crush them for. The preliminary injunction hearing arrived the following Tuesday. I put on my best suit and met David at the El Paso County Courthouse. Susan was there with the HOA's lawyer, a slick guy named Brandon Pierce who looked like he handled these disputes all day, every day. Judge Catherine Morrison presided, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s with a reputation for cutting through bureaucratic garbage. David presented our case efficiently, explaining the PRB1 regulations, the forged signature, the reckless removal, and the emergency communications angle. Brandon argued that the HOA had followed proper procedure, that I'd been notified appropriately, and that the damage was the result of my refusal to cooperate with the removal. Judge Morrison listened to both sides, reviewed the evidence, and asked some pointed questions about the certified mail signature. She held up both the signed receipt and a copy of my driver's license, comparing them. Mr. Pierce, she said, these signatures don't look remotely similar to me. Your Honor, we relied on the Postal Service's confirmation of delivery. Someone signed for this, but it clearly wasn't Mr. Nelson. That's a problem. She flipped through more documents, pausing at the letter from the Office of Emergency Management and the report from the FEMA representatives. Her eyebrows went up. Ms. Pemberton, Judge Morrison said, looking directly at Susan, did you know this tower was part of emergency communications infrastructure? Susan stood up. Your Honor, Mr. Nelson never mentioned that during our discussions. Actually, Your Honor, I said, and the judge nodded for me to continue. I told Ms. Pemberton exactly that right before they tore it down. I specifically mentioned FEMA and emergency broadcasts. She said it wasn't her problem. Susan's face went red. That's not how I remember it. I have a witness who heard the entire conversation. Judge Morrison made a note. We'll table that for now. Here's my preliminary ruling. The HOA is enjoined from collecting any fees or fines related to this tower removal, pending full discovery and trial. They are also enjoined from taking any further action against Mr. Nelson's property. Mr. Nelson, You will not reinstall any antenna structure until this matter is resolved. Both parties will participate in mediation within 30 days. If mediation fails, we'll set a trial date. It wasn't a total victory, but it was something. At least they couldn't put a lien on my house. Outside the courtroom, Susan glared at me. You're going to regret this, Isaac. Is that a threat? It's a promise. You've made an enemy of the entire HOA board, and we have ways of making your life miserable. David stepped between us. Ms. Pemberton, I'd advise you not to make threatening statements outside a courthouse. It's a bad look. Susan stormed off, heels clicking on the marble floor. Brandon gave David a professional nod and followed his client. Well, David said, that went about as well as we could have hoped. The judge clearly has doubts about their process, and the emergency communications angle is getting attention. How are things on the FEMA front? Haven't heard anything new in a few days. Keep me posted. The more federal interest we can generate, the better our leverage. That night, a massive thunderstorm rolled across the eastern plains, spawning 2 tornadoes near Strasbourg, about 30 miles east of Aurora. I watched the coverage on the news, listening to the emergency broadcasts, wishing I could be on the air helping to coordinate storm reports. Instead, my equipment sat useless in my garage, and the tower lay in pieces in my backyard. One of the tornadoes touched down near Interstate 70, causing a multi-vehicle pileup when visibility dropped to 0. Emergency services were overwhelmed, and according to the news, communications were spotty because cell towers were overloaded with traffic. The Skywarn network was active, but there was a gap in coverage, right where my station would have been positioned. I felt sick watching it. People had been hurt, possibly killed, and I couldn't help because Susan Pemberton thought my tower was an eyesore. The next morning, Margaret from Emergency Management called me. She sounded tired and frustrated. Did you see the news about last night? I did. We had a blind spot in our communications network right in your coverage area. 2 of our spotters couldn't get through on their radios. We ended up having to relay through a station 40 miles north, and the delay cost us precious minutes. Isaac, your tower needs to be back up. Believe me, I want that more than anyone. But there's a legal process now. I'm aware. We sent a formal letter to the HOA board yesterday, explaining the situation and requesting that they allow you to rebuild immediately. We're also working with FEMA to see if there's any federal leverage we can apply. I appreciate everything you're doing. It's not just for you, it's for public safety. 2 days later, David called me with news. The HOA wants to mediate. They're feeling pressure from multiple angles, and they want to resolve this quietly. What are they offering? Nothing yet. That's what mediation is for. But the fact they're willing to talk suggests they know they're in a bad position. The mediation was scheduled for the following Thursday at a neutral office in Denver. David prepped me thoroughly, explaining what to expect and how to handle myself. The key, he said, was to stay calm and reasonable, let them look like the bad guys. The mediator was a retired judge named Harold Webb, a grandfatherly man with white hair and a gentle demeanor that probably concealed a steel spine. We sat on one side of a conference table, Susan and Brandon on the other, with Judge Webb at the head. Let me start by saying that mediation is voluntary and confidential, Webb began. Nothing said here can be used in court if we don't reach an agreement. The goal is to find a solution that works for everyone. Ms. Pemberton, why don't you start by explaining the HOA's position? Susan launched into a prepared statement about community standards, property values, and the importance of maintaining aesthetic consistency in Ridgewood Heights. She made it sound like I was the villain, selfishly putting up an ugly tower without regard for my neighbors. When she finished, Webb turned to me. Mr. Nelson, your turn. I kept it simple. I'm a licensed amateur radio operator providing emergency communication services for this region. My tower was installed legally, with proper permits, before I even moved in. The HOA destroyed it without proper notice, forged my signature on documents, and did it in such a reckless way that they damaged my home and my neighbor's property. They also eliminated critical infrastructure during severe weather season, which has already resulted in communications gaps during last week's tornado outbreak. Webb made notes. I've reviewed the case file, including the letters from the Office of Emergency Management and FEMA. Ms. Pemberton, were you aware of the emergency communications function of this tower? Mr. Nelson mentioned it, but we had no way to verify his claims. For all we knew, he was making it up to avoid consequences. Did you attempt to verify it? Did you contact any authorities? Susan hesitated. No. Why not? We didn't think it was necessary. The tower was a violation regardless of its use. Webb leaned back in his chair. Here's the problem, Ms. Pemberton. Federal law, specifically PRB 1, requires HOAs to provide reasonable accommodation for amateur radio antennas. The key word is reasonable. Now, Mr. Nelson's tower was 70 feet tall, which is substantial, but it was also providing documented emergency services. A reasonable accommodation might have been to require some aesthetic modifications, or to set screening requirements, or to negotiate a height reduction. Instead, your HOA demolished it without any attempt at compromise. That's not reasonable, and you're going to have a very hard time convincing a jury otherwise. Brandon whispered something to Susan, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. Webb continued. Add to that the signature irregularities, the property damage, and the federal interest in this case, and I think you can see why you're in a difficult position. So let's talk solutions. What would it take to resolve this? David spoke up. My client wants several things. First, the tower rebuilt at HOA expense to the same specifications as before. Second, all fines and fees dropped. Third, compensation for the property damage, including the roof, garage, and neighbor's fence. Fourth, a formal written accommodation allowing the tower to remain permanently without future interference. And fifth, a public apology. Susan looked like she'd been slapped. Absolutely not. We're not paying for anything. Webb held up a hand. Ms. Pemberton, let's be realistic. If this goes to trial, you're likely to lose, and the damages could be substantial. Mr. Nelson isn't asking for punitive damages right now, which is generous. He's asking for the situation to be made right. The HOA doesn't have funds for this, Susan protested. We'd have to do a special assessment, and the homeowners will revolt. That's an internal matter for your organization, Webb said. But consider the alternative. If you lose at trial, you'll be paying much more, plus both sides' legal fees. The smart play here is to settle. Brandon leaned over and had a whispered conference with Susan. Finally, she said, We need to discuss this with the full board. Can we have a week? Webb looked at David, who nodded. 1 week. We'll reconvene next Thursday. In the meantime, I encourage both parties to think carefully about what a fair resolution looks like. During the week between mediation sessions, I got a surprising call from a reporter at the Denver Post. Someone had tipped them off about the story, and they wanted to interview me. I checked with David first, who said it was my choice, but that media attention could help our cause. I agreed to the interview. The reporter, a young woman named Sarah Martinez, came to my house and took photos of the damaged roof, the wreckage in the yard, and my garage shack full of radio equipment. We talked for over an hour about amateur radio, emergency communications, and what had happened with the HOA. This is a great story, Sarah said. David versus Goliath, public safety versus petty bureaucracy. When can I talk to the HOA? Good luck with that, I said. The article ran 3 days later on the front page of the Denver Post's local section. The headline read, Aurora HOA destroys emergency communications tower, FEMA officials concerned. It was a balanced piece, giving both sides, but the facts spoke for themselves. Susan had declined to comment, which made the HOA look guilty. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My phone started ringing with calls from other ham radio operators offering support. The ARRL posted the article on their website, and it went viral in the amateur radio community. Local news stations picked up the story. By the end of the day, I had 3 TV crews wanting to interview me. David called me that evening, laughing. You're famous. This is exactly what we needed. The HOA is going to be under tremendous pressure now. I didn't do it for publicity. I know, but it helps. Public opinion matters, especially with HOA boards. They're elected by the homeowners, and if the homeowners are angry, Susan and her cronies could find themselves voted out. The mediation resumed the following Thursday, as scheduled. Susan looked haggard, like she hadn't been sleeping. Brandon seemed resigned. "We've discussed your demands with the board," Brandon said. "Here's what we can offer. The HOA will pay for the roof and garage repairs up to $10,000. We'll drop all fines and fees. We'll provide written accommodation for a tower up to 50 feet in height. No public apology, and you pay for the tower reconstruction yourself." David looked at me, and I shook my head. Not acceptable. The tower was 70 feet because that's what's needed for adequate coverage. 50 feet doesn't work, and they destroyed the tower, so they pay to replace it. "We can't afford that," Susan said. "Do you have any idea what a 70-foot tower costs?" "Should have thought about that before you tore mine down," Webb interjected. "Let's break this down, piece by piece. The tower height seems to be a sticking point. Mr. Nelson, why specifically does it need to be 70 feet? I explained the technical requirements, the coverage patterns, the terrain considerations. At 50 feet, I lose about 40% of my effective range. It's not just about hobby contacts. It's about reaching emergency spotters and coordinators across the eastern plains. 50 feet doesn't cut it." Webb turned to Susan. "So your objection is purely aesthetic?" "It's about property values and community standards." "Has there been any actual study done on property values? Any data showing that Mr. Nelson's tower decreased values?" "Well, no, but it's common sense." "Actually," David said, pulling out a document, "we had an independent real estate appraiser review comparable sales in this neighborhood. Properties near Mr. Nelson's tower sold for the same or higher values as those farther away. There's no evidence of any negative impact." Susan had no response to that. Webb sighed. "Ms. Pemberton, I'm going to be blunt. You're not negotiating from a position of strength. The media attention alone is going to make this a nightmare for your HOA. Homeowners are going to be asking questions about how their dues are being spent and why their board created this mess. You're going to face recall petitions and possible personal liability if you're found to have acted maliciously. My strong recommendation is that you accept Mr. Nelson's terms, or something very close to them." Brandon and Susan had another whispered conversation. This one went on for several minutes, with Susan getting increasingly agitated. Finally, Brandon said, "We need a recess. Can we have an hour?" Webb agreed, and David and I went to get coffee at a nearby shop. "They're cracking," David said. "I'd bet money they come back with acceptance or something close to it." He was right. When we reconvened, Brandon laid out a revised offer. The HOA will pay for all property damage repairs, including the roof, garage, and neighbor's fence. All fines and fees are dropped. You can rebuild the tower to 70 feet at your own expense, and we'll provide permanent written accommodation protecting it from future HOA action. That's our final offer. "What about the tower reconstruction costs?" I asked. "We can't pay for that. The board won't approve it. We're already looking at a $15,000 special assessment for the repairs." David and I conferred quietly. "It's not perfect," he whispered, "but it's pretty good. You get the accommodation, which is the most important thing. The roof repairs alone are going to be $8,000 or $9,000. Take the deal." I didn't like it. I wanted them to pay for everything, to fully face the consequences of what they'd done, but David was right that the permanent accommodation was crucial. Without it, they could come after any new tower I built. "Add one more thing," I said. "The HOA pays my legal fees." Brandon shook his head. "Not a chance." "Then no deal. You forced me to hire a lawyer to fight your illegal action. You should pay for it." Webb looked at Susan. "He has a point. If this goes to trial and he wins, you'll be paying his legal fees anyway, probably along with substantial damages. This is cheaper." Susan looked like she wanted to flip the table, but she finally nodded. "Fine. How much?" David named a figure, a modest amount that covered his actual costs, plus a small margin. It was less than he'd have gotten from a contingency award, but he knew when to be reasonable. "Deal," Brandon said. Webb drew up the settlement agreement right there, and everyone signed. I walked out of that office feeling a mix of relief and frustration. I'd won, sort of, but I was still out the cost of rebuilding my tower, which would be at least $15,000 for a new tower, antennas, and professional installation. The next few weeks were a flurry of activity. The insurance company, now that the liability was settled, paid for the roof and garage repairs. A contractor patched everything up, and Tom's fence was replaced with a better one than he'd had before. David collected his fees from the HOA, and I got the settlement agreement in writing, notarized and recorded with the county. But I still didn't have a tower. I started researching options, pricing out equipment, and trying to figure out how to come up with 15 grand. My savings had taken a hit from the insurance deductibles and other expenses. I was looking at maybe having to take out a personal loan. Then something unexpected happened. The ARRL, which had been following the case, reached out to me. They'd set up a fund to help operators rebuild after disasters, and they considered my situation to qualify. They offered to cover $5,000 of the tower cost. The local amateur radio club, the Rocky Mountain Repeater Association, held a fundraiser and raised another $3,000. Individual operators from around the country sent donations, many with notes about how important emergency communications were and how my case had highlighted issues they were facing with their own HOAs. Within a month, I had enough money to rebuild. I hired a professional tower company, one with excellent references and engineering credentials. They pulled permits with the city, notified the FAA, since anything over 50 feet requires that, and scheduled the installation. The new tower went up on a Saturday in late June. It was a beautiful day, clear and warm, perfect for construction. About 20 people showed up to help and watch, including Margaret from Emergency Management, several other ham operators, Tom from next door, and even Sarah Martinez from the Denver Post, who took photos for a follow-up article. Susan stayed inside her house with the curtains drawn. The installation took most of the day. The crew dug a new concrete base, set the tower sections, installed the guy wires properly this time, and hoisted my new beam antenna to the top. By 6 in the evening, I was back on the air, making my first contact with a station in Kansas who'd been following the story. "Good to have you back, Isaac," the Kansas operator said. "We missed you out here." "Good to be back." That evening, we had a barbecue in my backyard, celebrating the restoration of the station. Margaret gave a short speech about the importance of amateur radio in emergency management. One of the older operators, a guy named Bill who'd been a ham for 50 years, talked about the history of the service and how operators had always faced challenges from people who didn't understand what we did. "But we persist," Bill said, raising his beer, "because what we do matters. Here's to Isaac for fighting the good fight." Everyone cheered and clinked glasses. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely happy. The story didn't end there, though. About a week after my tower was back up, I got a call from the U.S. Attorney's Office. They'd reviewed the case file, including the FEMA reports, and they had questions about the forged signature on the certified mail receipt. I met with an assistant U.S. attorney named Jennifer Walsh at the federal building in Denver. She was intense and thorough, asking detailed questions about every interaction I'd had with the HOA, particularly about the signature forgery. "Do you know who actually signed for that certified mail?" Jennifer asked. "No idea. It wasn't me, and it wasn't anyone in my household." We subpoenaed the Postal Service records. The letter carrier who delivered that day remembers the stop. He said a woman answered the door at your house and signed for it. He described her as middle-aged, short blonde hair, athletic build. My stomach dropped. That's Susan Pemberton. Your HOA president? And my next-door neighbor. She has a key to my house for emergencies, holdover from when we were on better terms. I never thought to ask for it back. Jennifer made extensive notes. So she let herself into your house to accept a certified letter that was addressed to you, forged your signature, and then used that forged receipt to claim you'd been properly notified? That's what it looks like. That's mail fraud, which is a federal crime. It's also identity fraud. We take this seriously. I felt a twinge of something. Not quite sympathy, but close to it. Look, Susan is a nightmare, but I don't know if I want her to go to prison over this. Mr. Nelson, she didn't just commit fraud against you. She used that fraudulent document to justify destroying federal emergency infrastructure. That's a bigger deal than a simple HOA dispute. I can't promise anything about prosecution decisions. That's up to my boss. But we're definitely investigating. A few weeks later, I was in my shack, participating in an emergency drill with other Skywarn operators, when I saw police cars pull up to Susan's house. 2 officers knocked on her door, and she answered in her workout clothes. There was a brief conversation, and then she was placed in handcuffs and led to one of the cars. I watched from my window, feeling a complicated mix of emotions. I'd wanted her to face consequences, but seeing her arrested was surreal. The charges were filed the next day: mail fraud, identity theft, and obstruction of federal emergency communications, all federal crimes. Brandon Pierce, the HOA lawyer, was also charged as an accessory, since he'd knowingly used the fraudulent document in court filings. The case moved slowly through the federal system. Susan initially tried to fight it, but the evidence was overwhelming. The handwriting analysis definitively proved she'd forged my signature. The postal carrier identified her in a photo lineup. The timeline showed she'd had access to my house on the day the letter was delivered. Eventually, she took a plea deal. In exchange for pleading guilty to mail fraud and obstruction, the other charges were dropped, and she received 2 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and a $10,000 fine. She also had to resign from the HOA board. Brandon got a similar deal, though his bar license was suspended for 6 months. The HOA itself went through a major overhaul. The homeowners, tired of the drama and the special assessments, voted out the entire board and elected new members who promised transparency and common sense. One of the first things the new board did was commission a comprehensive review of all HOA rules, eliminating outdated and unreasonable restrictions. They also issued a formal apology to me, which I hadn't asked for, but appreciated nonetheless. As for me, life gradually returned to normal. My station was better than ever, with upgraded equipment and better antennas. I participated in several emergency responses that summer, including providing communication support during a wildfire evacuation near Boulder and a flash flood in Colorado Springs. Every time I climbed into my shack and turned on the radio, I felt grateful. Grateful for the community that had supported me, grateful for the legal protections that had ultimately prevailed, and grateful for the opportunity to continue doing something I loved that also served the public good. Susan moved out of Ridgewood Heights about 6 months after her sentencing. I heard she relocated to Texas to live with family. I never spoke to her again after the mediation. Tom and I became close friends. He got interested in amateur radio and ended up getting his own license, call sign KE0ABC. We'd sit in my shack sometimes, making contacts around the world, and he'd shake his head at the whole saga. "You know what the ironic thing is?" Tom said one evening. "Susan was so worried about property values. But now that everyone knows about your emergency communication setup, people actually want to live in this neighborhood. They feel safer knowing there's backup communications if something happens." He was right. When houses in Ridgewood Heights went on the market, the real estate agent specifically mentioned the emergency communications capability as a neighborhood amenity. Property values had actually increased. The Denver Post did a 1-year follow-up article tracking the aftermath of the case. Sarah Martinez interviewed me, Susan, who declined to comment again, several HOA members, and officials from emergency management. The article highlighted how the case had sparked a broader conversation about HOAs and their authority, leading to proposed state legislation that would explicitly protect amateur radio installations in Colorado. That legislation, called the Emergency Communications Protection Act, passed the Colorado legislature the following year. It established clear guidelines for HOAs, requiring them to accommodate amateur radio antennas used for emergency services and setting strict penalties for interference with such installations. The bill was nicknamed Isaac's Law in the press, though the official name didn't include that. I testified at the state capitol during the committee hearings on the bill. It was nerve-wracking speaking in front of legislators, but I told my story and explained why the law was needed. Other operators testified too, sharing their own experiences with HOA conflicts. The bill passed unanimously in both chambers and was signed by the governor. Standing there at the signing ceremony, watching the governor put pen to paper, I felt like the whole ordeal had actually accomplished something bigger than just resolving my personal situation. 2 years after the tower came down, I got a call from FEMA. They were creating a formal program to identify and protect critical amateur radio infrastructure across the country, and they wanted to use my station as a model. They came out, surveyed the installation, documented the coverage area, and designated my station as a federal emergency resource. That designation came with certain protections and also some responsibilities. I agreed to maintain the station in operational readiness, participate in regular drills, and respond to federal requests during declared emergencies. In exchange, I got a small annual stipend to help with maintenance costs and priority access to certain types of emergency equipment. It felt like vindication. My tower wasn't just a hobby antenna anymore. It was officially recognized as critical infrastructure. The broader amateur radio community followed the case closely, and it became something of a landmark. HOAs across the country started revising their policies, and operators who'd been facing their own disputes suddenly had ammunition to fight back. The ARRL used my case in educational materials, showing how to document emergency service activities and advocate for reasonable accommodations. I became a reluctant spokesperson for amateur radio rights, giving talks at conventions and club meetings. I didn't particularly enjoy the attention, but I understood the importance of the message. We needed to educate the public, HOAs, and elected officials about what amateur radio operators do and why it matters. One of the most satisfying moments came about 3 years after the initial incident. I was participating in a statewide emergency drill, a simulated earthquake scenario that tested the entire emergency communications network. Cell phones were designated as down for the exercise, and all communications had to go through amateur radio. My station served as a critical relay, passing traffic between emergency management officials in Boulder County and response teams on the Eastern Plains. Margaret from emergency management was in my shack, coordinating the exercise, and at one point she turned to me and said, "Isaac, do you realize how many lives could have been at risk if your station wasn't operational?" When Susan tore down that tower, she wasn't just inconveniencing you. She was endangering an entire region. I tried to tell her that. And now it's documented, officially recognized, and protected by law. You did good. The exercise concluded successfully, and the after-action report specifically praised the effectiveness of the amateur radio network, with my station highlighted as a key node. Life moved on. I got a promotion at work, bought a better antenna for the tower, and adopted a dog named Murphy, who liked to sleep in the shack while I made contacts. Tom and I took a trip to Dayton, Ohio for the Hamvention, the largest amateur radio convention in the country, where I was unexpectedly asked to speak on a panel about HOA conflicts. Susan's name occasionally came up in conversations, usually as a cautionary tale. I heard through the grapevine that she'd completed her probation and was working as a yoga instructor in Austin. I hoped she'd learned something from the experience, though I had my doubts. The new HOA board in Ridgewood Heights functioned much better. They were reasonable, transparent, and focused on actual community issues rather than petty enforcement. I even served on the Architectural Review Committee for a year, helping to evaluate requests for exterior modifications. It gave me perspective on the other side of HOA governance, and while I never became a fan of HOAs in general, I understood that they could function properly with the right people in charge. My tower stood tall and solid, guy wires humming in the wind, antenna pointing toward the horizon. On clear nights, I could make contacts with stations in Europe and Asia, bouncing signals off the ionosphere. During the day, I monitored the local emergency frequencies, ready to respond if needed. It was everything I'd wanted when I first moved to Ridgewood Heights, and it had taken a legal battle, federal intervention, and a small miracle of community support to preserve it. But it was worth it. Sometimes, when I was sitting in my shack late at night, radio crackling with distant voices, Murphy snoring at my feet, I thought about that morning when I'd stood in my driveway watching the crane position itself next to my tower. How angry and helpless I'd felt. How certain I'd been that Susan Pemberton and her HOA were going to destroy everything I'd worked for. They had destroyed the tower, but they hadn't destroyed what it represented. The community of amateur radio operators, the emergency management officials who understood our value, the legal system that ultimately protected our rights, they'd all come together to rebuild something stronger than what had been lost. And in the process, we'd changed laws, educated the public, and protected countless other operators from facing similar conflicts. The tower wasn't just metal and aluminum anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, community, and the importance of standing up for what matters. Every time I flipped the power switch on my transceiver and heard the familiar hum of the tubes warming up, every time I made a contact or passed emergency traffic, I felt grateful. Grateful for the opportunity to serve, grateful for the people who'd supported me, and grateful that justice had ultimately prevailed. Susan Pemberton had torn down my tower, not knowing that FEMA used it for emergency broadcasts, but in doing so, she'd inadvertently sparked a movement that strengthened protections for amateur radio operators across the entire state. She'd meant to silence me, to eliminate what she saw as an eyesore. Instead, she'd given me a voice that echoed far beyond my backyard in Aurora, Colorado. The tower still stands today, reaching 70 feet into the Colorado sky, topped with antennas that connect me to the world and serve as a critical link in the emergency communications chain. It's a reminder that some things are worth fighting for, that communities can come together when it matters, and that even the smallest voices can make a difference when they refuse to be silenced. And on those rare occasions when I see a new HOA board member eyeing my tower with curiosity, I smile and invite them into my shack. I show them the equipment, explain the emergency protocols, and let them listen to the distant voices crackling through the speakers. Most of them leave with a new understanding and appreciation. Some even decide to get their own licenses. That, more than anything, feels like victory.